Our keynote speaker is Dr. Nadine McCleary. Dr. McCleary has done some wonderful research in equity. I was intrigued by the work that she's done around the patient experience and finding ways to get that conveyed electronically. I know at our cancer center, we asked patients how they wanted to get information, and most of them are like me, and they said, I want to talk person to person with my physician, which we don't always have the time to do. So if we can get that information in other ways and get it conveyed, it's a wonderful resource. Dr. McCleary is going to be speaking to us on meeting the impending storm of widening disparities in genomic testing. So Dr. McCleary.
Good morning, everyone here in person and those online. I just wanted to first thank and acknowledge Jim, Diane, and Megan, and the entire board and organizing team of the Partnership to Reduce Cancer in Rhode Island. This is a fantastic opportunity to share some of the work but really our community of oncologists, patients, patient advocates have been doing over the past several years. And so I will speak on the topic of supporting underrepresented populations, as was mentioned just a moment ago, in genomics and clinical trial enrollment, specifically addressing those gaps in cancer genomics in clinical trials. I'm an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. I'm a practicing gastrointestinal oncologist and focus on ways that we can use clinical informatics, electronic tools to really narrow gaps in standardized data collection. So first, I wanted to kind of set the stage regarding how we approach cancer. And this model may be familiar to many here. This is the cancer care continuum. This reflects the journey that a patient or individual will go through once diagnosed with cancer, but really starts prior to the cancer diagnosis in the area of prevention, which is where we'd like to shift most of our conversations moving forward. But once a cancer is detected, then we move through the formal steps of diagnosis, very anxiety provoking, fraught with a lot of uncertainty. And then we make a treatment decision, whether that's standard treatment, something that's approved by the FDA or the NCI or NCCN, all of these different regulatory bodies, or something that has been tested or is being tested in a clinical trial. And then our goal is to get to survivorship, meaning we've got a patient through treatment, they're now doing well and they're thriving. But we do also acknowledge that there's a portion of patients who still suffer from death from cancer because of failure of treatments or early detection. So I wanted to focus on how we could use biomarkers or the results of genomic testing to really intervene in all areas of this cancer care continuum. We use biomarkers to help us in early detection and risk reduction for patients or subgroups who are known to potentially have higher risk of cancer incidence. We also use it to help shore up the diagnoses that we make to clarify when a cancer is unclear or may present in an unusual way. We then tend to use biomarkers most in making a prognosis about survivorship from a cancer diagnosis, as well as predict potential response to treatments, and then the treatment plan, making our way through managing the patient's case, determining how successful we are, and then the response to treatment on the back end. So I wanted to focus our talk today really on strategies that we could all deploy to improve access and consent for specifically tumor genomic testing among populations of patients diagnosed in cancer medicine. And I realize I'm not clicking. I apologize. Megan, I see you there. Today's focus is on populations who are historically underserved, or as was mentioned earlier, medically underserved in cancer medicine. I'm specifically speaking of those who identify as Black, Hispanic, or those who are in the older age group of 70 or older. These are patients, as was mentioned through the prior talks, who may have a higher risk of poor outcomes from cancer once it's diagnosed. And my premise is that reduced access and low rates to tumor genomic testing really limits prognostic and predictive value and decisions for precision therapies and trials. The challenge here is that we know that there's a benefit when precision therapies and trials are offered in terms of quality and quantity of survival. And we feel that we can overcome some of these gaps in our workflow that are really systematic to increase genomic literacy for our patients and their care providers, improve navigation through our decision-making, and coordinate our workflow approach. I believe that increasing access and consent to tumor genomic testing can increase eligibility for precision therapies or trials, guide decision-making, and increase generalizability or precision diagnostic and therapeutic algorithms. What I will not touch on today, but is equally as relevant, is family history or inherited states such as what may show up in germline genetic testing, payer and policy implications, which are numerous, and then some of the limitations in genomic testing technology. So first, an overview of genomics in oncology. So the history of genetics or single mutation changes leading to disease and subsequent study of genomics or the behavior of one or more multiple genes began with Gregory Mendel's discovery of the loss of heredity in the 1800s. With rapidly growing technology and the ability to analyze now more than one gene, in fact, hundreds of genes at the same time, we as a scientific community have been able to elucidate the genomic code and establish easier methods for automating DNA sequencing. These advances really set the stage for use of biomarkers to increase precision and decision-making regarding cancer diagnoses, cancer therapies, cancer clinical trials, and ultimately improve cancer outcomes. That is our goal. The Precision Medicine Initiative, which was initiated and launched by President Barack Obama in 2015, was really aimed at realizing the promise of precision medicine. We had the tools, we had the abilities, but we hadn't really pulled together in a coordinated fashion to realize the promise of what this could bring, which is shown here on the slide. Instead of one treatment fitting all, regardless of your diagnosis, regardless of your circumstances, this is the therapy that you should receive. Our goal is to better personalize our approach to therapy, not just with the treatment, but our understanding of one's cancer course. So why is genomics so important in cancer care? Cancer, being a disease of the genome, occurs when there are changes in that genome, particularly in the DNA, that results in uncontrollable growth and division of cancer cells. These changes in genetic material or variants can be inherited or occur during an individual's lifetime, resulting in the development of cancer. So while genomics includes both the inherited or germline state as shown on the left, as well as the somatic or acquired state as shown on the right, most cancers, over 90%, really are attributed to the figure shown on the right, which are acquired over one's lifetime. There are about 5 to 10% that are suspected to be inherited. And so today I will focus mostly on those that are present within the tumor that you would find out after one's diagnosis that is acquired during one's lifetime. So in this genomic era of cancer medicine, we now understand that there's not one size fits all approach for any cancer or diagnosis. In my office, I have a sign that says there is no routine cancer, which really encourages and reminds me that every patient, every story that I approach is unique. There's no textbook cancer. In fact, many stories that you will hear don't follow the textbook in terms of presentation or response or any of those meaningful bits of information. So in fact, every cancer could be considered a potentially rare or unique cancer based on its genetic or genomic makeup. So here I show an example of a colorectal cancer because this is a cancer type that I see most often. And in colorectal cancer, in meeting with a patient, one of the first things that I want to understand is what is the genetic makeup of this cancer, because it can help me in terms of making some decisions and in discussion about prognosis with that patient. So graphically, what is shown is a list of common somatic variants or acquired variants that occur within the tumor that is present in colorectal cancer, the most prevalent of which is KRAS. Challenge here is that KRAS has many different subtypes. And so this is not easy, it's not straightforward, it's quite complicated. But to understand really the underpinnings of one's cancer diagnosis, we have to kind of sort through a lot of this complex information. So this is just an example of colorectal cancer, but I could show you similar examples for breast, lung, renal, et cetera, other cancer types. So again, still following this example of colorectal cancer out further, we can use our understanding of the genetics or the genomic makeup of how these individual cancer variants interact within a cellular environment to advance our understanding of the presentation of colorectal cancer, its prognosis, and guide our decisions regarding treatment outcomes. So many people aren't aware of this, but we actually divide colorectal cancer into different types based on this information. And then we use it in our discussions, particularly with our peers, in terms of making decisions about treatment and discussing with our patients what we would expect over the course of care. So again, very important information to have. And when we think about reducing cancer disparities, once a cancer is diagnosed, this is incredibly vital. So how do we fulfill then the promise of genomics in oncology? First, what is the promise? So in the past, when we met with patients, we would say, I think this is what we're dealing with. I have some rudimentary information that I can use to make a decision, but we didn't have a lot of very specific information. And we really based it on how someone presented in terms of how they felt. And so you'll still hear these stories. I hear them quite commonly of my family member was diagnosed at this time and this was their experience. And I have to highlight that many things have changed in terms of what we know about making decisions. So that brings us to where we are present day with evidence-based medicine. So we use a lot of the information that was shared by our colleague from NCI regarding clinical trials and outcomes. But again, these are very select populations and oftentimes exclude those patients who are hardest hit by cancer diagnosis and face worse outcomes. And so now our future, and I hope our immediate future, is really moving into more precision medicine, which is based on algorithms. But these algorithms are based on some information that may not fully be accurate. And so to Jim's delight, I hope I'm sharing a little bit of information regarding precision outcomes measurements, which is a different focus than genomics, but this is one of the areas that I work on, which is when patients come in and they're telling us about how they're feeling, especially after we've started therapy, that information actually is quite important and quite informative. In fact, we know that as providers, as a physician, and also a former nurse, that when I speak to a patient, I'm not getting all the information. I bring with it my own baggage, my own potential biases and blind spots. And so the information that patients share directly is going to be more accurate. So we started a process at our institution, and we share this with many wonderful academic sites and community sites who collect this information in a standardized and systematic way. This really was launched by Dr. Ethan Bosch and Deb Schrag and others at the NCI in the form of patient-reported outcomes, terminology around adverse events. And what they showed is in patients with advanced disease, these are our sickest patients diagnosed with cancer at Memorial Sloan Kettering, half of which were not familiar with computers, did not have an email at the start of the study, that by routinely reporting on their symptoms, they experienced a greater benefit in terms of health-related quality of life. And they had fewer hospitalizations, fewer disruptions to their cancer care, and surprisingly, they lived longer. This is just them reporting how they're feeling. So amazing that improving our communication and really standardize that helped us. And so what's shown on the right is our expanded portfolio beyond symptoms and adverse events. We also collect other information that's directly reported by our patients that really helps us to guide our therapy and better yet develop interventions that may happen earlier in the course of care. So back to genomic testing, this is what most people are familiar with is using this information to match one's presentation or genetic or genomic profile with potential therapies to improve outcomes. So we use this first with molecular profiling, which is just kind of fingerprinting, this is what your cancer is. So if I'm, again, speaking about colon cancer or colorectal cancer, I would not say this is a cancer located just on the right side of the colon. I would want to give more information about microsatellite instability and KRAS mutation and other important factors that help us to kind of fine tune our therapy and decision makings. The next goal would be to think about prognosis. When do we need to be very, very aggressive in our therapy? When could we lighten the intensity of treatment? And then make decisions about predicting response and appropriately monitoring that response. So again, an example from my home institution at Dana-Farber, colleagues there, Dr. Ethan Sarami and Michael Hassett, and others worked very carefully across our institution, developing a precision clinical trial matching tool that is aptly called MatchMiner. This is a fantastic tool. It's not yet patient-facing, meaning our patients don't have access to this, but we as providers do. And what this does is help us to sort through all of the complex information we receive once we do genomic testing to highlight trials that patients may be eligible for. And then as a researcher, if you are particularly focused on KRAS mutated studies, you can go into this database and reach out to patients who have that alteration in their genome and explore a trial opportunity with them. So it works both ways. So MatchMiner is something that is open source that they love to share, and we hope will be adopted more broadly or other tools similar to this. So as a result of those combined efforts, not only at our institution, but across oncology in general, we now have a very long list of approved targeted therapies that comprise about 75% of those drugs newly approved by the FDA over the past decade. This is incredible. This is the result of this concerted effort and everyone really pitching in and really sharing data to bring us to this point. And more importantly, what we're observing is that the response rate, the improvement on outcomes could be as high as 80% for some cancers based on use of these medications. Clinically, when I'm meeting with patients, the other thing that I would mention is not only are patients living longer, but they're living better. We don't have emesis buckets anymore, for someone expected to be very nauseous coming to the clinic. We don't have them in our clinic because we're not seeing that. It's very unusual. In fact, we get a chance to sit and have a conversation. You'll hear laughter when I'm meeting with my patients because they are feeling well. And oftentimes we're talking about things that they've been able to do in their life as a result of that. So let's shift into what are some of the inequities. We've talked about the promise, we've spoken about the history, but what are some of the challenges that we're facing, some of which you've heard today. So this is a breast cancer example, but I think it beautifully illustrates the myriad of challenges. And again, the storm that is rising around this issue of the genomics. Unfortunately, as we develop new innovations and new technologies, there's usually a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, or those who get and those who do not, those who have genomic testing and get access and potentially are more eligible for novel therapies, and those who don't even have access to that information. And so Dr. Olapade and colleagues really show here that it's a combination of not just the genomic testing, but it's the entire context, the system in which this sits that leads to delays in care, misuse, or underuse of treatment. So really important that we understand how to narrow this gap. And so here we are fully 30 years after the Human Genome Project, and we have yet to harness the full potential of genomics in oncology, and I would add for all patients. So again, back to colorectal cancer, because I think it's the topic of the day. When you think about screening, but even once a cancer is diagnosed, we have high incidence and high mortality across, way too high for many groups, across many groups, the highest, as was mentioned earlier, in patients who identify as Black. And I think this is very interesting because this is really what we're getting at is what are we missing out on? What are some of our missed opportunities? So years of potential life loss is a very nice way to accurately capture mortality. So how many potential years could you have lived had we not had this cancer diagnosis, or had we been successful in our treatment compared to what we're facing when we're not making headway in that area? And so what you can see here is for someone who is 65 and we are using 75 as our baseline, they would have 10 years of potential life loss, just an example. For someone who is diagnosed at 35, again, 75 as our baseline life expectancy, they would have 40 years of potential life loss. And so here you can see that the incidence rate is quite high, particularly in those who identify as Black compared to those who are of Latino or Latinx ethnicity and those who identify as Caucasian. And then when you compare that to the incidence, lower incidence, but still this very high level of years of potential life loss. So this is not just an individual issue. This is not just that community's issue. This is all of our issues, right? Because it really is affecting us as a society and it's affecting our health overall. So I want to highlight that health disparities really are speaking to a difference, something that is observed in terms of the overall rate of disease incidence, prevalence, morbidity, mortality, or survival compared to the general population. Inequities takes it a step further and says, this is a difference that we observe. Yes, this is a disparity, but it is systematic, and most importantly, it's avoidable, which to me is a call to action, right? This is something that we can do something about. And so let's start doing something about it. So I love the fact that, that earlier you heard about the disparities in terms of statistics in our current state in Rhode Island. These are some of the global disparities, and you've heard them as well from our colleague at the NCI. So I won't go over all of them, but just suffice it to say, these numbers are way too high. And seeing anything that says 111% should really make you very nervous and very concerned, because that should never be the case, particularly not in this genomic era in terms of the advances that we have made. So I've mentioned that over 3/4 of oncology drugs approved by the FDA in the past decade have been informed by genomic data, and that 81% of genomic studies, unfortunately, are still carried out in a homogeneous population, or patients who I say identify as Caucasian because many of us don't fully know all of our ancestry components. But only 4% of genomics data represent those who have been medically underserved or historically underrepresented in cancer clinical trials. So genomic data is essential for our decisions, and it helps us to think about precision therapies in clinical trials, but consent rates unfortunately remain quite low, even when, as in the case at our site, we have testing available free of cost to any patient who comes in. So to increase genomic testing among historically underrepresented populations, those who have worse potential oncology outcomes, we need to address two issues, one of access and one of consent. So I bring this article up. It's one of my favorites. This is by our Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, back when he was at the Brigham Hospital in Boston. He published this article 2004, about 10 years after the National Institute of Health Revitalization Act. And that was supposed to support an increase in representation on clinical trials of women and minoritized populations. And unfortunately, in that study, they saw that we had not made great strides as yet. Now, fast forward 2018, Dr. Guerrero and colleagues did a broader sampling, now looking at genomic studies, and starting from the very early stage genomic studies, risk stratification studies, to very broad genome-wide array studies and transcriptome studies of RNA, and still seeing similar low rates of engagement, not only in therapeutic studies, but the same issues have trickled down now to genomic studies. So we still have this large gap in who is contributing to this data. And remember, I said we hope to be in this era of precision medicine, where we'll be using some algorithms to help us make decisions. But if there are whole chunks of data missing, how accurate, how impactful will those decisions be? So what are some of the causes of gaps in genomics in oncology? So I don't think this is unique to health disparities. I do think these are factors that come up when anyone's facing a health decision, when they're facing a new diagnosis. There is persistent and significant challenges with distrust and with fear. And then I would add with racialized medicine in terms of a change being associated with an entire population of patients that may not really affect that entire group. So we're not really homogeneous. So distrust of sharing genomic data, fear of misuse of that data, and then some racism in terms of profiling based on genomic data. So let's first focus on challenges of distrust. Many, by show of hands, heard of Henrietta Lacks? Everyone, right? Which is fantastic, because I think in the past we would not have heard about the story. And in fact, it went underreported for many, many years. But this is one of many stories of challenges with distrust, and challenges where a system has been put in place that led to benefits, absolutely, but also engendered some distrust. So the largest figure on the slide shows a study of over 1,300 patients who were asked, in sharing genomic data, or at least thinking about sharing your cancer genome data, who do you trust to really secure that data and use it for its intended purpose? Do you trust academic researchers in the US or outside? Do you trust those in terms of security? Do you trust them in terms of privacy? And you can see the numbers are not that encouraging, and that there's not a high level of trust, regardless of the kind of caliber of the institution that may be conducting the study. Then the issue of fear. So there are certain and understandable concerns with risk of privacy and risk of unintended use of this data for other purposes like identification. And this is not only present on the academic side, as I mentioned, but also present when you think about consumer-based genomic testing modalities that are advertised on NPR, which I love to listen to, or on TV. So you may want to take advantage of that. You may think it'll provide you a benefit, but you may not, and you may hesitate because of concerns about how that data will be used and potentially commercialized. And then the concern about racialized medicine. And so race really is a social construct. It is not a biologic construct. It is used in order to understand really how we as different groups and how we move in our environment may have differences in how we experience our healthcare. And I think, as eloquently stated by Dr. Ioannidis and others, medical research should not aggravate already embedded gaps between those who have the privileged and those who do not have, or those who are disadvantaged in terms of their medical needs. But just as the lens of science has been used to establish the flawed premise of biological race-based differences, science should and could now focus on illuminating that which is represented by race and become a better trailblazer towards health equity. And I believe that's why we're all here today. So this is just a sampling of some of the recent literature concerning this topic, which has really hindered us. And I think given our recent experience, even with COVID, we've seen how this has played out and in some ways constrained our understanding of COVID. So I'm happy that we are all coordinated and moving forward. So without realizing it, I used a tree as an example, which I think pairs nicely with the tree logo used by the partnership. And so the question really is, to what extent are disparities in genomic testing, access, and consent due to an unequal distribution of resources? And so here's an example of two individuals of pretty equal height, and one is able to kind of just catch the fruit falling from the tree, so pretty convenient. And the other person is left on the other side wondering how they're going to get access to this. So we could provide ladders of equal heights, and technically now we've provided equal opportunity to get the fruit, but is it truly equal if there's really not a lot of fruit on your side of the tree? And that's what happens to a number of populations. And here you can think about, well, are there inherent differences? And maybe this is just how it's going to be, but I would argue against that. So here we have the fruit is technically accessible, it's all at the same height, but the individuals trying to get that fruit aren't. And so it makes it difficult for them to access it. And so really our focus should be on reducing disparities in testing, access, consent, and you can replace that with any factor. So providing equitable distribution of resources now by providing a ladder of the needed height for the person on the other side of the tree. So that would be equity, but more importantly, justice, right? So now balancing the distribution of resources so that you can actually get the fruit once you reach the tree. So that's really what we're aiming towards together as a collaborative. So how do we address some of these gaps? What are the gaps? You may be wondering, if you're a patient or advocate, gosh, I thought if I walked into my doctor's office and I'm meeting with my oncologist, they have all the information they need to make this decision, and they told me things would be fine. Well, that's our goal, and we want it to happen that way. And this on the screen is showing what a typical precision oncology workflow was idealized to look like. So day one, you meet with your oncologist. With a few days, your information, your tumor sample is being reviewed, the diagnosis is made, the sample is prepped for genomic testing and molecular analysis. All of the analysis is produced in the form of an easy to interpret report. There's a molecular tumor board at the ready to help guide your provider in terms of making decisions. And then a result in a treatment decision is rendered. And all of that ideally should happen within 2 weeks. So anyone have that experience? 2 weeks? One person. So unfortunately, what we know is that all along those idealized steps, there are potential areas where Patients may be, as was mentioned before, lost to follow-up, where things may fall through the cracks. So we may have challenges in getting the patient to the right testing. We may have challenges in getting it covered by insurance. We may have delays. We may have inadequate tissue. We may not have access to a molecular tumor board. We may not feel comfortable actually making a decision based on this information. So these are some of the gaps that are the reality of where we are in terms of actualizing the promise of genomics medicine. So now the good news, and there is good news, is what can we do to improve upon these gaps? And again, looking at this as a systematic effort. So this is not based on the individual. So our solutions to promote cancer care equity are pretty well known and appreciated. We are working hard to diversify those enrolled in cancer clinical trials because we make our decisions based on that information most often. We're also working to increase diversity within the oncology workforce so that patients who look like me, patients who look like you, feel very comfortable walking in the door and have a sense of trust. It's one step forward. I don't think it's a complete solution, but I do think it makes a difference. I think we're also working to improve access to cancer care, which is a big push for the partnership. And then for me, diversifying genetics and genomics research, which is how nowadays many of our decisions are made. And so as a representative of Dana-Farber, I wanted to share with you our mission statement, which was recently updated to reflect this broader scope. So our goal is to provide expert, compassionate, and equitable care to all patients, advancing understanding, diagnosis, treatment, care, and prevention of cancer and its related diseases. And we're doing that by training a diverse workforce. We're disseminating our learnings, and we're taking that to folks regardless of where they are, whether they're at our cancer center or not. And our goal is to really maintain a focus on those communities who we know historically have been marginalized in the area of cancer care. And so to operationalize our mission, these are some of the things that we have done. We have examined somatic genomic tumor consent rates at our institution, keeping in mind we have 5 different regional sites and 2 main campuses. Our main campuses had access to this innovation much earlier, in that we have a broad cancer study that offers genomic testing to most patients who come to Dana-Farber, and that's at no charge to the patient if they consent to the research study. That testing has now been advanced to a clinical test, so it's coming back to patients in the form of results similar to white blood cell count. So in our main campuses at Longwood and Chestnut Hill, which have had this tool available since 2011, the overall consent rates are in the 40% range. At our newer sites in Brighton and Merrimack Valley, 2021 and 2022 respectively, the consent rates are a bit lower. But again, they are later to adopt this as a system, but we anticipate that it will increase. And this is important because collectively, when we look at the demographics of our main and regional sites, we do have a very diverse population, but they're usually seen in different sites. And unfortunately, we do see a consistent message across the board, which is that those who identify as Black or of Hispanic or Latinx ethnicity, or those who happen to be age 70 or older, really don't have the highest uptake of this novel technology, that is genomic testing. And as a consequence, in terms of clinical trial enrollment, it kind of reflects also what we're seeing with rates of consent to genomic testing. And I don't think they're a one-to-one relationship, but I do think it speaks to those patients who may already be primed to think about cancer clinical trials, who may already be ready to be considered eligible for cancer clinical trials because they have this testing information accessible to their provider. And so back to the idealized workflow, this is what our workflow looks like. I won't read through all the steps, but I just wanted to highlight that we then took efforts to review these steps as a community and look at where we have gaps and identify which gaps are happening at the patient level, where we really have to intervene with that individual patient, and which gaps are really our responsibility as a healthcare system. And so you can see the ones highlighted in green. I know it's hard to read, but those are the most prevalent. Those are the ones that we are really focused on addressing. And so our leadership really called us together on a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And this is one of the key ones, to focus on increasing clinical trial enrollment and access at our institution, because that's a majority of what we are responsible for doing as a comprehensive cancer center. And so we have 3 different groups within our clinical trials access committee focused on this work. I lead the process work group, which is focused on where we are currently. And my colleague, Dr. Friedman, who chairs the entire committee, leads the engagement work. And then Dr. Lathan, who chairs our diversity and equity work overall at Dana-Farber, leads the intervention work. And so we are a multidisciplinary committee consisting of research staff, regulatory bodies, research coordinators, patients, patient advocates. We conducted a qualitative study of 10 patient interviews, 9 physician and 3 research staff interviews. And we've learned that the overarching barriers and facilitators to clinical trials really have a lot to do with logistical barriers. They have a lot to do with trust and communication. These are recurring themes that you have heard and will continue to hear, and again, give us a focus in terms of how to address this. And so separately, my research team looked at genomics in particular, so not just clinical trials, but the earlier step of genomic testing, and we're seeing the same issues come forward. There are challenges with understanding this information, what we call genomic literacy for our patients. What am I supposed to do with this? How could this help me? Why would I give you my information? And then also thinking about clinical trials as a next step. And is that really something that I would ever consider for myself? Maybe I don't want to do the testing if I would never think about trials. So in response to those and other avenues of work, we started a research study called SURGE, Supporting Underrepresented Populations in Genomics-Based Trial Enrollment. And SURGE really consists of many of the folks that I've previously mentioned. So you'll see Dr. Hassett, Sarami, Lathan, Friedman, but other leaders across our institution. And I really want to highlight our 2 stellar patient advocates, Cariana Belsancho, who represents our limited English, Hispanic Latinx populations, and Kim Drapkin. And then we're recruiting other patient advocates to join this work as well. And you can see we have team members kind of distributed throughout the workflow to develop strategies to address each of these systematic gaps that I highlighted a bit earlier. We also have providers who are based at our community settings, Dr. Kozareva and Dr. Sanz Altamara, who have been phenomenal champions to help us move this forward. So our goals are really threefold. One, we want to address challenges of genomic or medical literacy by providing decision aids for patients, by really helping our patient navigators help more with treatment decisions and genomic testing decisions. Traditionally, they help with resource and access, but have not really helped patients in terms of treatments, and they're moving towards that now based on this study. And then we'll conduct an intervention where patients will be randomized to the current workflow, where providers really are responsible for sharing this information, whether they're able to or not, given time constraints, versus having these additional educational tools to guide decision-making. So one will be a patient education video, and then additionally, a benefit of a navigator. So just a bit more about genetic literacy. There have been efforts to increase genetic literacy, including videos that you can find on YouTube and patient handouts, but you can see these are in English. The literacy level is quite high. They're not tailored towards those who are historically underrepresented and who may need a bit more support. And my colleague, Stacey Gray, currently at the City of Hope, formerly at Dana-Farber, started a wonderful study funded by the AHRQ called Hope Genomics to bring this information of genomics reports back to patients. But she also acknowledges that this is not tailored to the patient subgroups that I've mentioned. And so we've put together this video with the help of one of our wonderful patient advocates, Barry, and 3 representatives, including myself, who are physicians from historically underrepresented groups, really to aid and guide patients in what we're trying to do in terms of genomic testing, so they understand how this information could be used and how we've really addressed some of the risks that they may be concerned about. Then we're shoring up patient navigation to help set expectations of care, address some of those logistical or unmet social determinants of health needs, clarify risks and benefits, particularly when it comes to genomic testing, help guide interpretation of these findings so that they help to remind a patient, your information is now ready. Your provider will probably want to discuss this at your next visit. I'm happy to be present if it would help you. And also to support shared decision-making, truly shared decision-making with the provider, because many of us know this is not a one-time decision. This is an ongoing decision that needs to be made about how best to approach your care. And we're doing this work with navigation embedded within our entire comprehensive patient supportive services model, of which you'll see we have nurse navigators and we have lay navigators and resource specialists as well. And then I would add, fortunately, to the national efforts, there's been a lot of talk about clinical trials, but there are national efforts around genomics diversity in oncology as well. I've mentioned some of these groups earlier, but the Cancer Genome Atlas is one, Hope Genomics, the American Association for Cancer Research Project, GENIE, pulls together not only genomics, but some of your radiographic or pathology evidence, information about the neoplasia or the cancer. Other information we hope soon will include symptoms and symptomatic adverse events, and looks at how patients are kind of put together in terms of a phenotype or a presentation that really is precise and more tailored to who that individual patient is or grouping of patients may be. And then the NCI has created the Genomic Data Commons, which kind of pulls together all of these individual consortia into one group to standardize how we collect, define, and share this information, and to really provide a lot of reassurances, but also increase access and speed our ability to analyze this information quickly and share it across the cancer body. And so in conclusion, we are still focused on closing gaps in genomics diversity in oncology. And this is one of the schema that was proposed as kind of a timeline that we can use. And you can see at the very tail end, way out there, many, many years in the future, we'll start to think about diverse populations and ethnicities. But I would suggest and actually push that we move that forward. We move that earlier in the course of our discussion, in the course of our evaluation, in the course of any algorithm or database development, so that we can close the knowledge gap, particularly for those who are in urgent need of improving cancer outcomes, like those who have been mentioned in Rhode Island. I would be remiss if I did not thank funders who have supported this work quite generously. Despite the NIH and NCI's push to help in terms of addressing health disparities, we still need the support of philanthropic donors. And I am very grateful to Amy Ennis and her family, who was pictured here with her daughter Blakely in 2017. When we met, her daughter was just a toddler, and Blakely now is in second grade and doing quite well and quite independent, and Amy is still thriving. I'd also like to thank the Stancy family philanthropic support and the High Point investigatorship for their efforts. And then just as a reminder, this work is always personal to me. It's something I'm very passionate about. In the middle, you'll see my lovely parents, who are both cancer survivors themselves. My mom only recently a couple months ago, who just flew in from Naples, Florida, despite the hurricane, to help care for my kids while I'm here. My best friend, Meredith, who's shown in the next largest picture, two-time cancer survivor, starting in medical school and more recently, who's an anesthesiologist. Her mother and one of my close friends, Kesia, and family members in the middle, who all succumbed to cancer over the past decade, and my uncle, who was just recently diagnosed with colon cancer last week. Thank you all for your time and the opportunity to share a bit with you today.
Well, we certainly chose the right speaker, eh? Good job by the committee. We have a few minutes for questions for Dr. McCleary. And so if people have those, I'm glad I didn't say that Dr. McCleary has dedicated her life to this. She's dedicated her professional career to this. But I'm glad the last slide was the most important to me, that you include your family, your friends, and the people who mean the most to you. So, we can't separate our professional careers from our whole lives. And Dr. McCleary is a great example of that. Do we have any questions for her? Well, the first one I'd like to ask, I'm up here, I have a microphone, I can do that. If you're on, I know we have people on Zoom, if you want to get in the chat room with a question, but I'd like to hear just a little bit more about how you find out from patients how they're experiencing their treatments.
Thank you so much, Jim. I love talking about this topic. We formally call it patient-reported outcomes, but at our institution, we also consider other bits of information. So not just the outcomes, but how you present. So we use a broader term called patient-reported data. And so what we ask our patients to do typically when we meet is just to sit in a room with their individual provider and share a bit. But if you ever access your notes, you may be surprised to learn that not all the information you shared was really documented in the way that you envision it may need to be to really capture your experience. And so based on Dr. Bosch and Dr. Schrag and the work at the NCI regarding patient-reported outcomes, adverse event reporting, we started this effort. We started with an intake questionnaire for new patients to gather all of this information in a way that could be shared not only with the medical oncologist, but the surgeon they may see in the building across the street, so everyone could see the information at the same time. This also included the full care team. So our social workers have access to this information, and that's incredibly important. Our nutritionists have access, our nurse navigators, so everyone can understand where the patient is from their own words. We then use that information as well to determine risk stratification. So we use it to identify patients who may have Lynch syndrome, a genetic or inherited state that increases risk to colon cancer. We use it to understand what your logistical barriers may be to match you to the available resources at our institution to address challenges with transportation and housing and food insecurity and all of these growing gaps that we saw widen during the COVID pandemic, but they were present in cancer long before. We do this using an electronic platform that's connected to our electronic health record. So everyone has access to it. And then on the back end, we can pull all that information together to develop new learnings. So one of the studies we just completed really looked at how many patients really have logistical barriers, and is it limited to the subgroups that we thought, those who are racial or ethnic minorities or those who are older adults? And in fact, it's not. We previously thought that the needs were between 5 to 10%. We're learning that the needs are greater, 50%. And that's a population at Dana-Farber who were able to drive into Boston and pay $12 for parking. So imagine what that may look like in our regional sites, in our community practices, and in other states. So that's some of the work that we've started to do over the past few years. And we're moving forward now to really strategize on how to address some of those symptoms and symptomatic adverse events that lead to high rates of hospitalization.
Hi, Dr. McCleary. Thank you. Excellent. This may feel a little bit of a mashup question, but I'm concerned a little bit, or inquiring, I guess, about epigenetic changes related to lifestyles. And in particular, I think of what the previous speaker spoke about, of the need for diet and physical activity. I think of disparities in our minoritized populations as far as supportive oncology. And then I think of all of your colorectal work and epigenetic changes. And so when we look at things like the Genie program and some of these matchmakers in our EPROs, are we thinking about incorporating lifestyle, in particular with colorectal? We know that physical activity is so important. So really kind of supporting and being able to mark that. It may create a form of trust in that may be easier than a clinical trial right away with a medication. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
Oh gosh, that's a wonderful question. So I was privileged to be mentored by Dr. Jeffrey Meyerhart and Dr. Charlie Fuchs when he was at Dana-Farber, and my colleague Kim Eng. Many of us focus on issues of diet and lifestyle habits, and really the biggest challenge was understanding what was happening. So collecting the information really started with questionnaires with patients. Those questionnaires were embedded in clinical trials. So we got larger and larger understanding, greater and greater understanding of what are the diet and lifestyle factors, what are the ways that we can modify behavior, and what are the ways that we can support not just the individual, but the communities that may be affected by this. So really, it's not just about smoking cessation, but it's about how tobacco or cigarettes are marketed in certain communities compared to others, right? Or marketed at younger and younger age groups compared to others. So it's incredibly important. I'm glad you mentioned epigenetic changes as well, because it really ties nicely the kind of biology and the changes that can happen within the genome to what happens in your physical environment. I think of Project Genie, which is funded by AACR, as the best way to kind of pull all of that information together, because they are kind of standardizing collection of lifestyle and diet and behavior that is associated with cancer and in some cases causing cancer, and some of those genetic findings, and tying that in with the treatments that we give and the outcomes of those treatments is quite complicated. It's definitely not a one-to-one relationship, but having all of those data areas kind of filled out will help us gain greater understanding and develop better interventions.
Hi, I have a question. I was always intrigued if researchers find any difference between the Latino community who are newly arrivals, I mean, between the 5 years living in the United States and the ones who are born or I've been living here for a longer time.
Yeah, again, this is almost like nature versus nurture, right? Is that if you come from an environment where the habits may be different, where the food, where the environment may be different, where the risk factors may be different, you may present with cancer in a different way. We know that there are different patterns of how cancers present that are based on geographic location and based on cultural identity as well, which we think has a lot to do with shared environment. We've seen this most commonly in Asian populations. In fact, the colleague that I just mentioned, Dr. Meyerhart, did a fascinating study looking at diet, the Western diet that many of us adopt that is kind of high in fat and high in things that taste good but may not be the best for us, compared to a more traditional diet in Asian communities, and found that it does make a difference, and that the more Western diet is actually going to increase your risk of cancer compared to someone who is still maintaining a traditional diet. So I think there have been studies that have looked at that, and I think it's as you would suspect that the risk factors really are tied to how we have been exposed or exposed ourselves, or I would also add have been marketed to in terms of worsening some of our cancer outcomes. In fact, again, I mentioned I'm an NPR listener. The conversation just a few days ago was on President Biden kind of endorsing reducing some of the sugar that had been added back to our foods and some of the labeling of what's considered a healthy food. So these are some of the larger things that need to happen, but I think they're individual interventions that it sounds like the partnership is taking on and others are taking on as well.